Hey, all right, this is Tim back for Wrong Sports, and this is going to be a multi-part episode. It's going to be covering a subject that I've always wanted to cover for a while, and it's also a very positive subject, which I feel like we need right now. I'm going to be covering the military service teams during World War II. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, so just Army, Navy, and Air Force? No, actually none of them, and actually Air Force didn't technically start their football program until about a decade or so after World War II, but I will be covering some of the dozen or so other military service teams which played big-time college football from 1942 until 1945. So let me do a very quick history lesson. We'll start in 1941. America was going through the end of the Great Depression as most of the eastern part of the world fought during World War II. The 1941 college football season was an interesting season as the number one ranked team, Minnesota, started the year and also ended the year, but there were other schools like Notre Dame, Texas, Texas A&M, and even Duke that had an outside shot of winning the national title that season. The 1941 season was also significant because it ended about 2 weeks before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the eventual entry of America in World War II. The bombing of Pearl Harbor also forced the Rose Bowl to be moved to North Carolina, which gave Duke a home game essentially and a shot at an undefeated and potential national title. Unfortunately, that didn't happen as Duke would lose the Rose Bowl by 4 to Oregon State, and after the regular season and a few college bowl games ended, college campuses as well as college football would drastically change in the new year. With America's entry into war, all able-bodied men of college age had volunteered for or were drafted into the armed forces. This forced some college teams to either use walk-ons, younger players, or simply not even field a team. In addition, since it was now a world war, America increased its war effort by creating and establishing dozens of new bases all around the country, with some colleges becoming training grounds too. Along with these new Army, Navy, and Air Force bases, it created a new, different environment, not only in the way it looked, but also by the people that were housed there. One of the things that was different was that sports were used in the war effort. The U.S. War Department came out in fall of 1942 to say that they would start service teams. These were teams made up of the men at each of these bases, with most teams having collegiate as well as professional players on them. The War Department thought that sports would not only bring the bases together to work as a team fighting the enemy, it also used football as a training ground of sorts to find the best soldiers and also find guys who, if they survive war, could play potentially after the war. These service teams were going to play exhibitions against other service teams to raise money for the war effort, but after a few weeks, some of these service teams played full college schedules, with some even in the running for the national title, which I'll go over later. So you might be wondering, were service teams new in the 1940s? Actually, they weren't. There were actually a few service teams in 1918 and 1919 while America fought in World War I, but there weren't as nearly as many service teams in World War I as there would be during the World War II years. In all, during the 1942 through 1945 seasons, there were 34 service teams who played, and I'm going to cover a few of the best and most interesting service teams. Also, here's another big note. You will hear me mention the V-12 program, and to kind of summarize what that was, it was basically where colleges or universities, they were training grounds for officers of the Navy and Marines, and the V-12 program also helped with lagging attendance at those colleges due to most college-aged men and women going to war or working respectively. Most of these V-12 programs were at smaller colleges and universities, so some schools' football programs did take advantage of the new training recruits on campus, but not all of them did. And that's why I felt I need to mention it, because you will see some of these college football teams get a whole lot better during the war years and then just really lagged off after the war ended. The Army also had a program. It was called the V5 program, but they were mostly at larger universities, and those larger universities didn't take advantage of the new recruits on campus, so it didn't really make as much of an impact on their football as the V12 program did. And just two more small final notes before I start with 1942, you will hear me talk about some ages of some of these players, because some of them were actually professional players playing against college kids, so I felt like I needed to mention that. And I will also be breaking up each of these videos in years. So this first video is going to be about a little bit about 1941 and 1942. Then I'll do another video about 1943, and then I will have a third video about the 1944 and 45 seasons. And I do that because the 1945 season really didn't have as many service teams as the previous year. So after I give you that little introduction right there about the service teams, we're going to start with 1942. Now, I mentioned before how service teams didn't get too big until 1943, but the 1942 season still had 18 service teams play at least 6 games. Now, most of the games that the service teams would play would be against other service teams, but some, including the ones I'll be going over more in depth on, played an almost full college conference schedule. But the 1942 season started off with one of these service teams making news with an upset of sorts. Now, I'm going to first start with Iowa Preflight. They were a fairly new Navy pre-flight aviation training school, which opened April 15th, 1942 on the campus of University of Iowa. There was a quick ceremony to kick off the school, during which the governor of Iowa made certain facilities at the University of Iowa to be used for the training of naval aviators. Now, just because Iowa Preflight was on campus, it didn't mean the University of Iowa was gone. It actually meant that they basically were both using the campus for higher education as well as naval training. They were also both using the campus for their football teams, and even though they were sharing the field, Iowa Preflight rarely played at home this season. The one thing that Iowa and Iowa Preflight mostly shared during the 1942 season was that they played a majority of Big Ten conference teams, as well as they both had Big Ten coaches. So in 1942, Iowa Preflight was coached by the legendary Bernie Bierman. If you don't know who he is, after the 1941 season, he took a leave of absence from one of the Big Ten powerhouses at the time, Minnesota, to become an officer and also become the head of the physical education department at Iowa Preflight. Bierman wasn't the only thing from University of Minnesota, as he was able to coach his former center at Minnesota, George Fesden, as well as former Northwestern quarterback George Benson. Now, Iowa Preflight started their season with a huge win over Kansas, and then they beat Big Ten team Northwestern, who were QB'd by Otto Graham. Yes, that Otto Graham, who would become a household name after the war when he QB'd the Cleveland Browns to multiple titles. But Iowa Preflight's third game would be a pretty big upset as they defeated national champion Minnesota. This was Bierman's former school, and they beat him 7-6. This propelled them to another win, this time over Michigan the next week, to make them 4-0, heading into a big game with Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame was coming off an undefeated 1941 season and lost not nearly as many of their best players as other colleges did this season. Plus, they still had the legendary coach Frank Leahy, as well as future Heisman winner Angelo Bertelli and Johnny Lujack. Notre Dame would beat Iowa Preflight 28-0, but these two teams would continue this rivalry throughout the World War II years. Iowa Preflight would rebound with 3 wins in a row over another service team as well as Nebraska and Indiana. This means that Iowa Preflight, they beat 4 teams in the Big Ten, but couldn't get past their 5th team as they played Ohio State. And Ohio State at this time, they were ranked in the top 5. They were coached by Paul Brown. Yeah, the father of modern American coaching. Ohio State were coming into the game annoyed as their only loss in that season was to Wisconsin in what is now called the Bad Water game. But they were the Big Ten Conference winners going into this final game for them due to having one more conference win than Wisconsin. This would also be Ohio State's final game of the season, and Iowa Preflight were looking for an undefeated record in the Big Ten. Unfortunately for Iowa Preflight, they wouldn't get the job done and lost pretty badly, actually, 41-12, and Ohio State would end up winning the national title that year, giving Paul Brown his only college title in his second year at Ohio State. Iowa Preflight would end their season with another loss, ending their season with a record of 7-3, which is pretty good. This time, their loss was really close to the University of Missouri, who would also go on to win their conference this year. Iowa Preflight is definitely a service team that I'll be getting back to, especially when I cover the next year, 1943, because they were well known during the war to have one of the best teams and also play one of the toughest schedules of any service team. The 1942 schedule for Iowa Preflight included 9 games against either teams in the Big Ten or the Big 8, as well as also playing Notre Dame. No other service team could match the murderer's row of teams that they had to play, and also the talent they had to play, as they played 3 Heisman winners this year, as well as the national champion and 9 teams from larger conferences. Iowa Preflight would show how much the 1942 tough schedule helped them in the next year. So I talked about Iowa Preflight, but I'm going to talk about another service team that had an incredibly tough schedule and is one of my favorite teams to talk about, and that is the Great Lakes Naval team. They are actually the Great Lakes Navy Blue Jackets football team. Another reason why I like this team. They, like Iowa Preflight, played a daunting schedule of Big Ten as well as other respected college football teams. Plus, they would probably have one of the most talented teams of any service teams, especially in 1942. Great Lakes Blue Jackets weren't a new team either, as they had football teams during World War I, as well as they also played some games in 1941. They would also have another advantage in that their base was located just outside of Chicago, so they would get to pick and recruit the best men for training and also for their football team. The first thing that they did was hire a coach, and they hired a really good one. They hired Tony Hinkle. And if you live in Indianapolis or went to Butler University or know anything about Butler University, you definitely know who he is because most of their athletic buildings are named after him. He came to the shores of Lake Michigan to coach the football team in 1942 and 1943. And when he got there, he realized his team would be better than most. Hinkle was a football, baseball, and basketball coach at Butler, as well as run the athletic department, so he knew how to coach talent and also find it. But when he got to see the Great Lakes Navy football, he would say it was the best talent in the country, as they would have several professional players in Bill Radovich, as well as Steve Belichick. He was a Detroit Lions player, as well as the father to the future 6-time Super Bowl winning coach Bill Belichick. Plus, the team's talent was even better as they had a Heisman winner on their team. They actually had the 1941 Heisman winner on their team, Bruce Smith, who 2 days after Pearl Harbor won the Heisman Trophy and would then join the war effort less than a month after his win. So with this team and the coaching of Hinkle, the Great Lakes Navy Blue Jackets were a force to be reckoned with, as they would go 8-3 this season, and with one game left against Notre Dame, the game was played in Chicago, and it was used to raise money for the war effort, as well as also allow a lot more people to attend the game, since Soldier Field was a much bigger stadium in the Midwest, and was actually probably the biggest stadium in the Midwest at the time. 35,000 people would show up to see the 8-3 Great Lakes Navy Blue Jackets against the 7-2-1 Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Notre Dame would come into the game with a top 10 ranking, as well as wins over Navy and Army, along with beating Iowa Preflight. So Notre Dame was one of the best non-service teams this year. Great Lakes matched up with Notre Dame and fought all game before having to accept a 13-13 tie, but this helped them later as they would face Notre Dame every year throughout World War II, and Great Lakes would end the season 8-3-1 and be voted on by the Associated Press as the best service team this year, and I will definitely be mentioning more of their teams as I keep going on throughout the years. And the final service team that I'm going to be mentioning for the 1942 season is a team that has to do with the South's oldest rivalry. It's the Georgia Preflight team. They were a Navy V5 program on the campus of the University of Georgia. Now, V5 is different than V12. I explained it earlier. And Georgia Tech was part of the V12 program at the time. Georgia Tech took big advantage of being a V12 school as they had their pick of the best talent in the country. But Georgia, even though they couldn't recruit players from their V5 program, they still had a great team this season as most of their players hadn't even been recruited to war until after the season was over. But going back to Georgia Preflight, even though they were not at a V12 school, they had a football team, and they had a very good one in 1942. They went 7-1-1. They also beat Auburn and Alabama this season, which really didn't change anything in the SEC title race, as it was mostly a two-horse race between Georgia and Georgia Tech, who would both play each other on November 28th, the same day as Georgia Preflight played their final game, beating Bama. And Georgia came into the game 10-1, only losing to Auburn the game before, and Tech coming in the game undefeated. Georgia would destroy Tech in this game 34-0, winning the conference, the rivalry, as well as winning their way to the Rose Bowl. This would lead Tech to using some of their V12 players to their advantage and would destroy Georgia over the next 2 years, including never giving up a point in 1943 or 44. Georgia Preflight never had players cross over to the Bulldogs during the war, and Georgia's coach Wally Butts even put a vote to his players in the 1943 season if they should play because so many of their upperclassmen went to war, leaving the Bulldogs with mostly an undersized and younger players on their roster until 1945. So as you can clearly see, Georgia Preflight was mostly using their men from their school only. Georgia Tech, who was also using players from Georgia Tech, they would cherry pick players over from their V12 program into their football team, and the Georgia Tech V12 school did not have a football team during any of these years, so that's why it enabled them to cherry pick some of their best men. So to summarize, the 1942 season had a bunch of really good new service teams, and I actually didn't cover two of the best teams this year. The 2nd Air Force, they went 11-0-1 this season. They mostly played a lot of smaller schools and also a lot of other service teams out west, but they did beat Arizona as well as Idaho, and they tied Washington State this season, so a pretty good record for them. And I also want to mention the 1942 North Carolina Preflight Cloudbusters football team. I don't know if I can say that 5 times, but I love that team. I will be covering this team later on when I get to 1944, but the 1942 North Carolina Preflight team, they were coached by Jim Crowley, who was the famous player from the Four Horsemen Notre Dame team, as well as he also coached Michigan State before this and Fordham. He would coach the North Carolina Preflight Cloudbusters football team to an 8-2-1 record, and this team actually tied Georgia Preflight early in the season, and they would beat NC State as well as Syracuse and Temple all this season. So again, another really good service team that I felt like I need to mention. I'm not going to mention it in a long form this season because I do want to mention their 1944 season, and I will mention that later on. So thank you so much for hanging out with me in part 1 of the World War II service teams. This was only covering the 1942 season. I will be covering the 1943 season in my next video, and then in the third video, I'm going to be covering the 1944 and 45 seasons. And as always, follow me on Twitter at SportsWronged, and give me a like, and also share this video and subscribe to my channel. And thank you so much, and I'll hang out with you again.